says this is a platform that is meant to build bridges between and amongst Africa. Remember that says that until Africans learn to own their own problems, find their own solutions, they won't be able to write their own stories. That's the essence of the Pan-African drive here, building bridges between and amongst Africans. And we delve deeper now into the pitfall of African leadership and its overwhelming effects on the liberty or unionism of this continent of Africa. I always trace back to history in 1963 in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, where 32 heads of state and government sat there and spoke about the need for the liberty, the independence, the stability of this continent of Africa. But 62 years after that, they are still turning in their graves in tears with disappointment that the current generation of young people, the current generation of African leadership, has not been able to catalyze that very energy they exerted back 62 years ago in Addis Ababa in terms of becoming very independent. Like Thomas Sankara says that he who feeds you controls you. He was the first African leader to have stopped foreign aid, reduce his salary, then remove all of the presidential vehicles and change that into motorbikes, so to speak. That why should I have AC in my office when an average Burkinabe does not even have a fan in their residence? I don't need that. Now, it begs the question, where did we get it wrong that we've not been able to catalyze the energy or enhance the energy from pioneers of Pan-Africanism like the Julius Nyerere, the William Vakanara Shatwa Topman, the Ame Sekou Touré, the Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Bendo Wasabanga of Congo, the rest of the people? Where did we get it wrong?
Yes, a very heavy question, Tony. We have to, as you have rightly said, always revisit history. It is true that when the independent bells, or the bells of independence started sounding in Africa, then the new governments that came out wanted, some wanted really to see that complete independence from their colonial masters. And let us define the word. Independence means a complete severance of that control that the colonial masters had on them. But then let's go back a little bit into history again. We have to understand that Africa did help develop Europe. That is the fact. It helped develop, yes, it undisputed.
Manpower capacity.
Undisputed. And this didn't start in the 1900s. No, it didn't start in the 1800s. It started far back from the 15th century, when explorers started discovering the continent, if I can call it that. When they started discovering America, and when they said, oh, here is a land to exploit, and they saw opportunities because that was the industrial era in Europe. They were desperate to see now how they can boost their industry. You know, they are discovering charcoal. They wanted energy, electricity and all that. They were using petrol, etc., like we were using in Africa here. So what happened, once they get to see a continent that has an opportunity to help them, then they grabbed it. And slavery started. Slavery helped the British Empire, you know, in greater ways than you can imagine. By enriching the empire. But not only that, you also had the French Empire. Because remember, French at the time was an empire in the 15th century, up to close to the 18th century. So what happened during all that period was that slavery continued and it flourished. They accepted it because it was bringing sugar from the new world, as they call America at the time, and it was also bringing a lot of other materials. But they were also able to sell a lot of new items to the Americas through the slavery, because there's a lot of things that were happening at the time. When slavery ended in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, then they realized the continent would need to have a new approach. And this is when they said, okay, let's explore the continent further and see what we can have. They started sending explorers. That's when you hear about David Mungo Park, a host of them. And they started discovering, not only Africa, they also went to Asia, but they had their own history with Asia. To focus on Africa, they came in, you know, this is how South Africa, for example, was grabbed at the time. This is how you find a lot of other places such as Ghana and others that had gold that allowed the venturers such as Mungo Park to want to venture inside through River Gambia to see if they can get the gold in Ghana. So all of these things happen. When they realize now that the continent has the potential, so grapplers started coming. All these European continents that were also in the midst of their industrial era wanted a piece of it. And this is why the Berlin conference happened in 1885. This is what happened when they had to cut the cake, as the expression goes, and divide the continent. Okay. You have the Portuguese taking their share, the French taking their share, the Belgians taking their share, the English, British taking their share. The two most powerful at the time were the French and the British, so naturally they had a much larger share. And here now is the continent under colonial rule. They come in, the English, for example, indirect rule. They just hold a part of the colony, explore the country, the city or the town to see whether there is something else, minerals or anything that they can exploit. Sometimes they exploit even all the other possibilities, how they introduce groundnuts, for example, in the Gambia, what we call the peanuts. And the French decided to take a different approach. They call it assimilation. And then they use that to train these Africans to be cultured like they want them to be able to learn French, understand the culture, you know, and then naturally convert them to Christianity like they did also in the British colonies. Okay. What happened after that? Then, because of this education, naturally these Africans started seeing the opportunity to free themselves. And some of these came to understand civil rights movements happening in the US. Okay. They understand also some of the discussions that were going around universities in Europe. Yeah. So then they brought out this Pan-Africanism, whose conference started now in the US, and the idea started being mooted in the UK, and then the whole concept of liberation, of ownership, of wanting autonomy, of independence started emerging. Yeah. The first African states that started getting that independence, that pushed it. I'm not counting Liberia here, because it's a different one where you come from. Okay. I'm not counting Ethiopia because history shows us that Italy attacked them, but they could not subdue them. But let's say the African countries that were finally subdued and were under colonial rule, they eventually started seeking for independence. And some of them started getting it. The Francophones started getting it in 1960, but the Anglophones started earlier. Ghana, 1958, for example. Yeah. And then Guinea-Conakry in the same year. So you have a few other countries that started. And when this happened, some very, let's say, great leaders, among them Kwame Nkrumah, you mentioned, thought that it is high time that the continent begins to come together, inspiring himself from what happened in the US, where like-minded individuals came together and created a united front on the continent, a kind of a federal kind of government. And that idea was mooted. Haile Selassie accepted it and then hosted in 1963 the first convergence of leaders. And we know the history. They arrived, they discussed, and Kwame Nkrumah was very passionate. Anybody who listens to him speak at the time would see that energy into him. And he said, if the African continent is not united, then there is no need to have independence, even for Ghana. The idea was, we have resources, we have the opportunities as one continent to come on together and be a power force against all the others, America and Europe. But you know that would not tell well.
No, not at all.
Yeah, because those who knew they had to depend on Africa to continue to resource them in the height of their industries would find it difficult to accept. So naturally, you know what happened. The CIA came in. They have been credited to have created a lot of coups where many leaders have been killed. Yeah. Be it in Congo, Patrice Lumumba died because of that. Kwame Nkrumah was deposed. He had to die in exile in Guinea-Conakry. And then you have many others, be it in Togo, many other countries. Yeah. They died. Only those who are in the Francophone system and who accepted what we call the Francophone agreement of what we call an independence under French rule were the ones who were saved. So practically what happened was the leaders at the time had to subdue, to accept, to be still under some kind of remnants of that colonial control, yeah, which eventually was coined as neocolonialism, that allowed them to survive. Some of them said, okay, This is an opportunity for us to probably transit, but others were practically enjoying that opportunity because with that kind of privilege, they were enjoying certain things coming from the colonies, but at the detriment of their own countries. Military rule started coming in Africa, and we have seen how history has evolved. Some countries never got out of it. Others, the disparity between the states and the people continued to grow. Dictatorship didn't help much. Where South Korea started in the 1950s with a GDP that is equivalent to that of the Gambia or that of Ghana, after 50 years, they have become a super economic power today, exporting Kia, exporting Hyundais, exporting Samsung, and Africa is still grappling with emerging from their natural resources that they are still giving out at pittances to the colonial masters.
Prof, I will hold you right there. We're going to have a quick break, and once we will have returned, then we can go deeper into tonight's conversation. It's already getting very beautiful. We'll take a quick break, and we get back shortly. So this is the Pan-African Drive. Here with me, Tony Michael Howard, as your host, with a fountain of knowledge that I say here, a museum of knowledge here. And tonight we're so blessed to have, like I described, in a fountain of knowledge, if you like, a museum of knowledge. That's Professor Cherno Barry, who is offering his expertise on different areas concerning the African leadership and its pitfall, as well as its overwhelming trickle-down effect on the African continent. Prof, just before we talk break, I was asking you, where did we get it wrong?
Yes.
There was an agitation from our pioneers for African liberty. And in their graves, 62 years after that very famous speech there, they would have thought that we are on top of our game. But regrettably, 62 years after their speech, we're still struggling. We, in fact, a nation of Nigeria that is described as a giant of Africa. Under the Joe Biden's administration, it has been described as a nation of particular concern and activated under the current leadership of President Donald Trump. Our democracies are fragile because of the dependency syndrome, you know, weak institutions and so to speak. And the list just goes on and on. So where did we get it wrong? Where are the missing pieces?
You know, there's this expression that goes, strength is in the unity, or strength is in unity. The more the numbers unite, the more there is a strength, there is a force. If you see America today is considered, for example, one of the superpowers, and the USSR was also one of the superpowers, is because it brought powerful nations together to unite under one umbrella in a federal form. And Africa could have that. So where are we getting it wrong? What we are grappling with, as I said, is interference first of all, in the governance structures of our independent countries.
Yeah.
That interference is not allowing that opportunity for African states to unite and become one. That interference is done by still the former colonial masters who see in Africa still what we call the, where they are still milking natural resources to boost their economies, to boost their industry, to improve their economy.
Yeah.
Because, just take for example Niger. Niger has uranium, the quantity of which probably is still immeasurable. But France was getting uranium from Niger at pittances. Why? Because they were a former colonial master, and there was that agreement that they could enjoy the uranium at a practically, zero. Because the kind of price that they target, it was zero until the present government took over, and when the analysis, they realized that they have been losing millions and millions. Niger is still grappling with getting electricity. France is getting complete electricity 24 hours using the uranium. You can give millions of other examples. What I'm trying to say here is that there is a need for a complete change in the mentality and the perception of governance in Africa.
A paradigm shift. That
paradigm shift. We need to get to a point. I know the African Union today, which is born out of the Organization of African Unity, that has already got a plan. They call it the 2063 plan, where they are hoping that by then Africa would have emerged, would have accepted at least, even if not political, but an economic kind of unity, where they would help each other, build one market, allow the movement of goods and services across the continent, create some kind of borderless opportunities, where people can move freely, like it is happening in Europe, like it's happening in the United States, and allow people to be able to exchange goods, to share experiences, etc. But unfortunately, this is not happening. And the other thing that is also a deterrent to that is the kind of education we have inherited. The education we have inherited did not prepare us to build our continent. It was more of the type of education that continues to perpetuate the whole concept of that civilized African that came from Europe, such as Amadou Hampâté-Bâ has depicted, and also Cheikh Hamidou Kane in the Ambiguous Adventure, where they've clearly defined how Africa has lost that opportunity because they have not trained the brains. If you go to South Korea, I mentioned it earlier, it's the brains they train. And those are the brains that have changed, they created the shift in South Korea. If you go to China or to Japan, they depend on the human resources to build them, not natural resources alone, because if the human resources are properly prepared, whatever natural resources there are
will be properly managed.
Exactly.
Properly utilized.
So the transformation of that and the processing of that would be easier.
Yeah.
Because then the human resource would have been well prepared, well endowed. Unfortunately, Africa has not really, after 60-something years, provided that opportunity, that type of education to the continent to allow it to emerge from these issues. So what that now means is that among the reforms that are happening, be it the sub-regional bodies or at the level of the African Union, it needs to give much focus on improving the minds, meaning to develop the minds of the African continent, the African people, to promote that diversity, open up the borders further, with a minimum control at the moment, yes, I understand, because it is a transition, and gradually open the borders and allow people that free movement where African states will start creating a market. Gambians are preparing, cultivating maybe, they can cultivate yam for Nigeria or for Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone and Nigeria can cultivate rice for us, because they have the space and everything. So instead of having to import food that probably is even harmful to our health, we might be doing business amongst ourselves, creating our own markets, and eventually having our own currency. And I can tell you, at that level, economic boost would happen even in the Gambia, which has a much smaller population, because the trickle-down effect of that African unity, that African economy, would reinforce and strengthen the country, Gambia, and eventually we will be able to face the opportunity to sell our products, local products. We will be even diversifying our economy by creating other products that our minds would, force us to do, and then that's going to be prosperity.
A beautiful point here from my guest tonight. He's offering a whole lot of stuff here that you need on a Pan-African Drive. Like we said, this is the only platform that provides you an opportunity to have used the African solutions for the African problem. Wherever you are, under the sound of our voices here on a Pan-African Drive, this is Teledar TV with me, Tony Michael Howard. And I am with Prof here as we speak. When you mention education in your point right now, back in 1964, the Liberian orator Dao Twe says that, as far as I am concerned, no nation has been able to establish and maintain a strong government with a poor, ignorant population. He went further to say that the development of our future tomorrow depends on the rapidity with which we mass educate our people. It begs the question, to what extent do you think education has the possibility for keeping our respective nations independent and very protective and void of foreign interference or intervention that leads to a deficiency on our leadership that even undermines the integrity of our regional and continental bodies? To what extent education have a major role to play?
That's very interesting, because first of all, if you leave the education in the hands of others to control and manage for you, naturally what happens is that the type of education they give you would be an education that's not going to be to their detriment.
Okay.
What I'm driving at is that we inherited a colonial education, colonial system of education. Okay. And I'm sure many of the African countries, they didn't bother to do serious educational reforms that would now align with the needs of their countries. Like China did, like, as I mentioned, South Korea did, like Singapore did. Because Singapore was also an improbable nation. Yeah. It cut off from Malaysia, and it was a small country that has practically no resources and decided to develop the brains of its own people. If you go to Singapore today, it's one of the fastest growing economies, if not even the greatest economy. Yeah. In fact, there was a time when in the 1980s when Jawara, the first president, wanted to use a blueprint. He was using the Singaporean model.
Okay.
But the Singaporean model would have required that massive investment be done in education. And what does that mean? The need for that education must come from the country. The country government itself to understand what their needs were. And they would send people to go and study primarily the type of education that they need to develop their country. It's not the way to, where to colonial masters give you scholarship. Okay, we can give you 500 scholarships to go and study literature like we did, but then only 2 scholarships to study medicine. So naturally, you will not get the number of medical experts that you need in your country. So you will continue to be dependent on the medical expertise of another country, which is certainly the developed country, because that's what they need. They need a market to grow. Okay. So they will not give you what is going to destroy their markets. So unfortunately, most of these countries didn't do it. You've mentioned Nigeria, for example. Nigeria has a lot of resources. If the education had gone the right way it should have done, probably Nigeria would have been the flag bearer of African unity, of African development. Because as you have rightly mentioned, they are what we call the big brother. They are one of the very few countries that have really the potential to grow in area of education, but also to develop the natural resources they have to a point that would have advanced this continent. And they would have been a good model for many other African states to emulate. What we are seeing is horrible. You have a lot of countries today, even the infrastructure is still poor. The mineral resources are abundant in their countries, but the exploitation of it is left to foreign industries and companies. The people don't even have any say into the exploitation of it. And it's enriching a very few on the top, allowing a lot of others to suffer. It is also creating unrest between countries. We've mentioned the issue of DRC and Rwanda. Yeah. But if you look at the area where the contention is, primarily, it's an area where the diamond is in abundance. In abundance, yes. So that begs the question, is the fight not probably because there is something there that is benefiting one and at the detriment of the other, or that is not properly managed, or there is another third party that is ensuring that the instability continues for their own benefit? So these are some of the questions we have to raise to ourselves and to our people, and also to our governing bodies. Because until we are able to answer this, until we are able to take full ownership of our education systems, until we are able to redefine the true form of education we need, and we dictate that education to ourselves, and make sure that our people are prepared to take up not only leadership, but even economic development of our own countries, we will continue to wallow in that poverty, unfortunately, because then the dictates of this development is not coming from us.
That's a great one there for you. Quickly, Prof, we don't have much time, but quickly, if you were seated before African heads of state and government in a hall today, how would you scan Africa in terms of the key problems that are undermining our regional arms of leadership as well as continental leadership? Because if you check the dependency syndrome, we are struggling. If you go to the United Nations General Assembly, when it is time for the rest of the world to speak, the Europe and the Americas and what have you, that hall is crowded, so to speak. African leaders want to listen in their majority. But when it is time for an African leader to speak, you see that the hall is virtually empty. That means something is wrong somewhere. Yeah. If you come back to ECOWAS, that's the Economic Community of West African States, currently in the Gambia, is partly sponsored by the European Union. You understand that? Yeah. So even the arms of leadership on the continent, or at regional level and continental level, that should be fully independent, are still under the umbrella of our colonial masters, so to speak. So if you are to scan Africa in the face of our leaders, to pinpoint key areas of challenges or their errors that are having overwhelming negative trickle-down effect on regional leadership as well as continental leadership that is undermining our unity and togetherness? What would be your scanning exercise to African leader? What are the major problems and how do we resolve them?
Thank you. You've already mentioned really very, very sad situations in which we are with regards to our own regional bodies. Apart from ECOWAS, if you go to the AU too, we are hosted in a complex that was granted freely to us by China.
Sadly.
But at the same time, the AU is not, the budget of the AU is primarily being given by a foreign body too. So what are we trying to say? We are trying to say that the continent is unable to take its own destiny, independently in their own hands. What I'm just trying to say is that unity is not only written on paper. No. Presently, the African Union has all the paperwork ready. Everything is there. But we do not have the will of the African states to see that Africa is united. I don't think we also have the will of the sub-regional states to see that the sub-region is united. What is happening is that there is a breakup in the ideologies, in concepts, in understandings of what type of unity we need. Okay. And where we are driving towards that form of unity, we still are weak by allowing influences that come from outside that would destabilize that progress. So what it means is that, first of all, the African state must take a resolve. They have to make a resolve that this continent must rise from what it is now. Gambia independently might find it difficult to rise fast. They said, when I am walking, I can walk fast. Okay. But when we are together, even though I can walk slow, but I can walk far. What that means is that being together as a group, it will allow a country like the Gambia, which has no resources, which has practically very little population, to rise from where it is now. Because as a state, it can have what we call the backing and the support of many other states to do that within that united body. Countries like Nigeria or South Africa or Ethiopia that have already advanced in many other areas can consolidate in those strengths they have, and that can have a trickle-down effect on many other countries. What I'm saying is we need to forget the selfish nature that we have, that weakness of saying we will start, we can go independent, we can go on our own, we will be able to make it without the others. That is not true. What is the use of going to the UN? If at the UN, one, when you are speaking, nobody's there. Two, what you say is practically repetitive. Every year round, whatever plea you make is not even listened to. I mean, I would say, look, why not Africa create its own UN here? I mean, say, okay, you know what? You can keep your UN, we will keep our UN. It's probably a drastic step coming from a diplomat. But look, at some point, we need to wake up and realize that we are not always obliged to conform when conforming does not give us any progress. When we conform, we are not seeing anything that is of benefit to us. So at some point, we have to be, we have to take the bull by the horns and say, you know what? We are ready for a severance. If there is no advantage to our belonging, in any particular body. Why should you want to be in a body where you have no advantages? They pick you in the numbers to make it credible. But whatever is done is not your advantage. Whatever is done is not your benefit. Whatever is done is the benefit of a very few. Why should it be the case? So Africa, I think, must build its own institutions first. The ECOWAS must be strengthened as a sub-regional body. It must also filter towards the AU to be strengthened as a sub-regional body, as a regional body. And Africa would be the most powerful continent that I can predict now if all the countries in Africa agree to unite in purpose, to unite in strength. They don't have to dismantle their structures. They have to first agree to say, we know what, economically we need to build an economic model as a united front amongst us, and then build it from there. They can also build a military might, a federal military that can stand to defend the continent of its own. So eventually what will happen is that it will bring a new lease of life to what we will call the African model. And most probably, all the other continents will start looking up to us as a potential force to reckon with.
That's a beautiful one there from you. I'm afraid we are not too far from the end of this program. But Prof, just before we take leave of you, I want you to spend at least 45 seconds to a minute to speak to the Gambian populace ahead of the 2026 general and presidential elections. There are emergence of political parties, and so to speak, there are a lot of divisions here and there. What's a piece of advice to Gambians ahead of the elections in terms of the maintenance and peace and stability, in as much as it in their inalienable right of choice of partisanship? But what should be the focus is the Gambia of our homeland, peace before, during, and after the election. Your final words to Gambia in one of the vernaculars, so to speak, that you're very fluent with.
Thank you very much. Well, man lak Olof pour wax ne léegi ñi ngi ñëw dem si exactly in 1 year time to the elections, national elections, pour elect President of the Republic of the Gambia for the next 5 years after 2026. Li may ñaan mooy ñu ñëpp buñ seet lan moo ñu séddale. Li ñu séddale war naa mën a bëri waaye li ñu boole moo gën a ëpp doole. Nañ seet ne nguur ki fa toog ak ki fay toogi lenn rek lañ fay fekki mooy jafe-jafe bu nit ñi ñëpp am waaye niñ koy defee ni ñuy liggéeyee pour mun a génne jafe-jafe bi boobu la ñoo yokkante xalaat pour nekk benn su kenn waxee ne daal man maa gën a mun a def na seet keneen koo xam ne mën nay def li ko man ñoom ñëpp ñu ànd ñu nekk benn am ay political party yu bëri mën naa esi jaxasoo yu bëri man yaakaar naa ne su élection bi di war a jege war nañoo mun a jokkoo nekk benn ñu seet parti boo xam ne jege na si suñ xalaat gi ñu nekk ak moom mu nekk benn parti yi wàññeeku nga xam ne ñiy dem si vote duñ gis ay kees yu bëri ndax vote boobu noonu dafay gën a isi jaxasoo dabay ñaanati nañ xam ne dëkk bu am jàmma moo gën dëkk bu bëri fitna affaire élection bu mu isi fitna si biir dëkk bi mooy tànn sa nguur rek soo amee kenn koo xam ne neex na la bés bu mu génnee di waxtaan nga dem fekki ko bés bu mu nekkul foofu noonu nga dem sa kër nga toppatoo sa soxla nga bañ a jóg di ay wax yoo xam ne dafay isi ay fitna ma dafay isi ay jaxasoo may dafa isi ay seddaare dëkk bi war koo mën a man jël te xam naa ne suñ bàyyul xel mën naa isi tamit ay fitna yoo xam ne ñun ñëpp duñ ko antan kon nag loolu la ñooy ñaan Gambien si yëpp di leen gërëm di leen sant di gërëm nag suma xarit mooy Tony koo xam ne moo ñu invite fii di wax affaire yi jokkoo nekk benn def intégration muy Gambie ak Sénégal muy Gambie si boppam muy Africa.
And that's a very great one there. Like we said, this is the Pan-African Drive, and that's how we come to the end of this very exciting edition of the Pan-African Drive. But the quotation of the day says, "A masquerade that dances far from those who beat its drum will eventually dance off keys." I repeat, a masquerade that dances far from those who beat its drum will eventually dance off keys. In other words, a leader that serves people outside the support of the very masses he represents, he'll be acting in error. And guess what? The ballot box is there to call you to order if you make mistake. You must understand that when you are leading your people, you are at the service, and you must respect the values, the social contract that maintain you people as a nation, as a state. In the absence of that, you will be off that seat on the ballot box. Thank you very much. It's been a great experience. Bye-bye.